When Mary Jemison was still a young girl living with her family on the Pennsylvania frontier, she could not have imagined that she would spend nearly the rest of her life inside an entirely different civilization from the one into which she had been born. At that point, she was simply the daughter of Scotch-Irish immigrants trying to survive along the unstable edge of British settlement in North America, helping her family with daily labor, while thousands of other frontier households slowly pushed inland, searching for land, security, and permanence. But the frontier surrounding Mary's childhood was already far more complicated than many colonial families understood. The forests beyond those settlements were not empty wilderness waiting to be occupied. They were part of an enormous indigenous world connected by rivers, trade networks, diplomatic alliances, and ancient trails that stretched across the continent long before British colonists arrived there. Seneca hunting parties moved through those regions regularly. Delaware and Shawnee communities maintained their own territories and political relationships. French traders crossed the interior carrying weapons, cloth and news between distant settlements and native nations. Haudenosaunee diplomats attempted to preserve fragile balances of power, while British expansion continued pressing westward year after year. And by the middle of the 18th century, those worlds had begun colliding more violently than ever before. The British Empire and the French Empire were fighting for control over the interior of North America, transforming forests, river valleys, and frontier settlements into part of a much larger imperial conflict that would eventually become known as the French and Indian War. But while politicians in London and Paris argued over maps and territorial claims, the people actually living along the frontier experienced the war in far more intimate ways. Families disappeared during raids. Villages burned. Trade routes became military corridors. Entire indigenous nations were forced into impossible political decisions about alliance, survival, and territorial defense, while colonial settlement continued spreading deeper into their lands. It was inside this unstable and changing world that Mary Jemison disappeared in 1758, after a frontier raid carried out by indigenous warriors, allied with the French, reached her family settlement in Pennsylvania. But Mary's story did not end with her capture. In many ways, it began there, because over time, she would stop being merely a girl taken from the frontier and become part of another world entirely. Living among the Seneca through decades of war, migration, territorial collapse, and continental transformation, while the America around her slowly became something new. Before the raid that changed Mary Jemison's life forever, her family lived within the exhausting routine shared by many frontier households in western Pennsylvania during the middle of the 18th century. Survival depended on constant labor. Forests had to be cleared by hand, cabins repaired before winter, livestock protected, fields planted and harvested quickly enough to endure seasons that could become brutally melting, unforgiving once the cold arrived across the interior valleys. For immigrant families arriving from Europe, the frontier often seemed to promise independence and opportunity, but daily life there was shaped by uncertainty far more than stability. Settlements remained scattered and isolated from one another, connected by rough trails that became nearly impassable during rain or snow, and many families lived with the constant awareness that imperial wars, indigenous resistance, or shifting territorial disputes could suddenly reach even the most distant farm. At the same time, the world surrounding those settlements was still overwhelmingly indigenous. The forests beyond colonial clearings were part of a living network of territories, hunting grounds, and diplomatic corridors maintained by native nations for generations. Seneca communities connected the Great Lakes to the Ohio Valley through movement, trade, and kinship. Delaware families displaced by earlier colonial expansion were already moving through different regions, searching for security. Shawnee groups migrated across enormous stretches of territory while trying to resist the growing pressure created by British settlement. French traders and interpreters moved constantly between forts, villages, and river systems, carrying news that often reached indigenous communities long before colonial settlements heard it themselves. And above all of these movements stood the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, one of the most sophisticated political alliances in North America attempting to preserve influence over a continent whose balance was beginning to fracture under imperial competition. Leaders like Gayasuta and other Seneca diplomats understood that British demographic expansion posed a long-term threat far greater than isolated military battles. Every new road cut through the wilderness eventually brought surveyors, settlers, militias, and land speculation behind it. Every frontier cabin represented the beginning of a larger colonial presence that rarely stopped expanding once established. But for families like the Jemisons, those larger continental transformations often felt distant compared to the immediate demands of survival. Mary's world, at least while she was still young, was shaped more by chores, harvests, family routines, and the rhythms of frontier domestic life than by imperial politics. She helped with labor around the settlement, lived among siblings and parents, trying to build permanence in an unstable region, and probably imagined a future not very different from countless other colonial girls growing up along the edges of British America. What neither Mary nor her family fully understood was how quickly the frontier around them was beginning to collapse into open violence. By the late 1750s, the French and Indian War had transformed much of the Pennsylvania frontier into a landscape of fear, retaliation, and military instability. Raids became increasingly common, as indigenous warriors allied with the French attempted to slow British expansion into contested territories. Colonial militias retaliated with their own violence. Rumors spread constantly between settlements about attacks, burned farms, and missing families somewhere deeper along the frontier. And slowly, the war that once seemed distant began moving toward Mary's world. In the spring of 1758, the violence that had been spreading across the Pennsylvania frontier finally reached the Jemison family directly. A raiding party composed largely of Shawnee warriors, allied with the French, moved against the settlement where Mary's family lived. Part of the wider pattern of frontier warfare that had begun consuming entire regions during the French and Indian War. For families living along the frontier, these attacks often came suddenly and with very little warning. Settlements existed far apart from one another. Communication was slow, and once a raiding party crossed into a region, there was rarely enough time for isolated farms to organize any meaningful defense. What followed was usually confusion more than battle. Gunfire echoing through trees, smoke rising from cabins, families attempting to flee through forests they barely understood compared to the indigenous warriors moving through them with speed and familiarity. Mary watched her world collapse in a matter of hours. Members of her family were killed during the attack. Others were captured beside her. The familiar routines that had defined her childhood only days earlier disappeared almost immediately as the captives were forced westward, away from the settlements and deeper into the interior forests beyond British control. At first, Mary likely understood very little about the larger forces surrounding what had happened. To her, the raid was personal catastrophe. Fear, exhaustion, grief, and uncertainty would have overwhelmed everything else. But the frontier war consuming Pennsylvania was not simply a series of isolated attacks. It was part of a continental struggle unfolding across enormous distances where indigenous nations, European empires, and colonial settlements were all fighting over the future of North America. French officials hoped indigenous alliances could slow British expansion into the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region. British colonists believed westward settlement was essential to the future of the colonies. Haudenosaunee leaders attempted to preserve political influence while navigating impossible diplomatic choices between imperial powers that increasingly threatened indigenous autonomy, no matter who won. And somewhere inside those enormous historical forces, Mary Jemison was carried westward through forests, rivers, and indigenous territories that would slowly become the center of her new life. The farther the captives traveled, the farther Mary moved from the world into which she had been born. But she was also moving toward another world entirely, even if she could not yet understand it. At some point during the journey westward, Mary was separated from many of the other captives and eventually adopted into a Seneca family whose own losses during the war had left deep emotional wounds inside the community. Two Seneca women, mourning the death of a brother, chose to bring Mary into their household as a replacement within the family structure. Following a practice that had existed among Haudenosaunee communities for generations, to colonial society. Captivity was often imagined only as brutality and imprisonment, but indigenous adoption traditions operated within a far more complex social and spiritual framework. War had taken countless lives across the frontier, and mourning rituals frequently included the incorporation of outsiders into families that had lost relatives. Adoption could transform captives into members of the community itself over time, especially among children and younger captives who gradually learned language, customs, and social responsibilities inside indigenous life. For Mary, however, the transition must have felt overwhelming in the beginning. Everything around her changed almost at once. The language spoken around her no longer sounded familiar. The structure of daily life was different from the colonial households she had known in Pennsylvania. Food, preparation, labor, social relationships, and family organization all followed rhythms shaped by Seneca traditions rather than British colonial customs. Inside the longhouses where multiple generations lived together, women exercised forms of authority that surprised many Europeans who encountered Haudenosaunee society. Clan identity shaped political and social belonging. Agriculture sustained entire communities. Cornfields surrounding villages were maintained collectively through labor that tied families and clans together across seasons and generations. Meanwhile, the world beyond the villages continued shifting violently. The British Empire gradually gained the upper hand in the war against France. Forts changed control. French influence weakened after major defeats in Canada. Traders, interpreters, and military officers moved constantly across indigenous territories, attempting to secure alliances before the balance of power changed completely. Leaders like Gaius Suter traveled through the same frontier regions where Mary now lived, trying to preserve Seneca and broader Haudenosaunee influence during a moment when the future of the continent itself seemed uncertain. And slowly, almost without realizing it at first, Mary stopped existing only as someone separated from her old world. She began learning how to live inside a new one. As the years passed, Mary became increasingly integrated into Seneca life, not as a temporary outsider, but as part of the community itself. She eventually married a Delaware man named Sheningi, and together they moved through a frontier world that remained connected far more by rivers, forests, and indigenous pathways than by colonial roads or political borders. To Europeans arriving from the Atlantic coast, much of the interior still appeared immense and difficult to control. But indigenous nations had long maintained networks of diplomacy, trade, and movement across those same lands. Villages were connected through kinship and alliance. Hunting territories shifted seasonally. Canoe routes linked distant regions together. Messengers carried political information across hundreds of miles with remarkable speed. Mary's daily life unfolded inside that indigenous continental world. She learned agricultural labor alongside Seneca women. She raised children inside a society organized very differently from British colonial settlements. Seasonal rhythms shaped community movement and work. Winters demanded preparation and endurance. Summers revolved around planting, harvesting, and maintaining food supplies that entire villages depended upon. And all the while, the frontier around them continued changing. After Britain defeated France in 1763, the balance of power across North America shifted dramatically. French influence over the interior weakened, but instead of bringing stability, the end of the war accelerated British colonial expansion westward. Frontier settlements multiplied. Surveyors and land companies pushed deeper into contested territories. Roads slowly expanded through regions that indigenous nations still considered their own. Leaders such as Pontiac attempted to organize resistance movements against British expansion as indigenous communities increasingly understood that colonial settlement itself posed the greatest long-term threat to their survival. The British Crown responded with the Proclamation Line of 1763, theoretically limiting settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains in an attempt to reduce frontier conflict. But settlers ignored the boundary constantly. Families kept arriving. Cabins became settlements. Settlements became towns. And the pressure on indigenous territory continued building year after year. And by then, Mary herself was no longer simply observing indigenous life from the outside. Her children were part of that world. Her labor sustained that world. Her family belonged to it. By the time the American Revolution began in the 1770s, Mary Jemison had already spent many years living among the Seneca, and the political world surrounding her family was entering another period of enormous instability. What had started as a colonial rebellion along the Atlantic coast quickly spread into the interior, transforming indigenous territories into strategic battlegrounds once again. For many settlers in the eastern colonies, the revolution became a struggle for independence from British rule. But for large portions of indigenous North America, the conflict raised a very different question. Which empire, if any, would slow the endless expansion of colonial settlement into native lands? Among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the war created deep divisions. Some communities leaned toward alliance with the British, because British officials at least promised to restrain westward settlement after the war. Others attempted neutrality, understanding how dangerous direct involvement could become. Some families and villages fractured internally as political loyalties divided entire communities. Figures like Joseph Brant emerged as influential indigenous military and diplomatic leaders attempting to preserve Haudenosaunee autonomy, while the colonial world around them descended into full-scale war. Joseph Brant, known among the Mohawk as Thayendanegea, emerged during the American Revolution as one of the most influential indigenous military and diplomatic leaders in North America. Unlike many frontier warriors imagined later by American mythology, Brant moved constantly between indigenous and British political worlds. He had received part of his education within an Anglican missionary environment, spoke English fluently, and developed close relationships with British officials who viewed him as a crucial ally during the war. Over time, his appearance itself began reflecting that complicated position. Between civilizations, Brant often wore adapted British military clothing while still maintaining Mohawk identity, symbolism, and political loyalty to the Haudenosaunee world he was trying to protect. To many indigenous communities, alliance with Britain was not simply loyalty to the crown, but an attempt to slow the relentless colonial expansion threatening native territories across the frontier. Mary lived through these years not as a distant observer, but inside the communities directly. Affected by the conflict, she watched villages prepare for uncertainty. Hunters returned, carrying rumors from distant forts. Messengers arrived with news about troop movements, raids, and retaliation campaigns. Families relocated between settlements, searching for safety as violence spread across the frontier. And then, in 1779, the war reached Haudenosaunee territory with devastating force during the Sullivan Campaign. American military forces under Generals John Sullivan and James Clinton marched systematically through Seneca and Cayuga lands, destroying villages, orchards, and stored food supplies in an attempt to permanently break indigenous resistance in the region. Longhouses burned, cornfields were destroyed, fruit orchards cultivated for generations were cut down. Entire communities fled deeper into the interior, trying to survive the coming winter. For Mary, this destruction was not abstract history. It threatened the people she lived with, the communities where her children were growing up, the agricultural systems that sustained daily life, the villages that had become home. And as the revolution transformed the Atlantic colonies into the United States, it also accelerated the collapse of indigenous territorial power across enormous portions of the continent. Mary Jemison lived long enough to witness the frontier transform almost completely from the world. She had first entered in 1758. By the early 19th century, roads, canals, expanding towns, and American settlements increasingly dominated regions that had once been connected, primarily through indigenous diplomacy, trade, and seasonal movement. The forests remained, but the political world inside them had changed. Land companies acquired enormous territories through treaties that many indigenous communities considered deeply unfair or coercive. American settlement expanded relentlessly across western New York and the Ohio Valley. Missionaries, traders, and government officials moved deeper into Seneca lands, while indigenous political autonomy steadily weakened under the growing power of the United States. During those years, Mary herself became increasingly known among nearby settlers as the White Woman of the Genesee. Travelers visited her. Writers recorded her memories. Her life fascinated Americans because it seemed to exist between categories they struggled to understand. Some viewed her as a captive who had never truly escaped. Others imagined her as a symbol of frontier survival. But neither interpretation fully captured who she had become. Mary had spent most of her life inside Seneca society. She had raised children there, worked there, endured war there, and watched entire indigenous communities struggle to survive the violent transformation of the continent around them. By the time she reached old age, many of the worlds that shaped her earlier life were disappearing. Indigenous territorial control across the Northeast had diminished dramatically. Frontier settlements had become permanent American towns. Roads crossed lands that once could only be traveled through indigenous trail systems and river routes. The America emerging during Mary's final years was not the same continent into which she had disappeared as a young girl during the French and Indian War. And perhaps that is why her story still feels so powerful centuries later. Because Mary Jemison's life reveals how deeply intertwined those worlds truly became. Not separate civilizations existing far from one another, but families, nations, empires, and communities forced into continuous contact across generations of war, migration, diplomacy, and survival. She was not simply a woman captured on the frontier. She became someone who lived long enough to witness one America fading, while another rose in its place. If you enjoy stories about people between worlds, subscribe to Primordial Lands.